Hello everyone. This lecture today is going to be covering chapter 5 of your MERIB text, which is covering all the information about the integumentary system. Okay, so let's get started. I think the integumentary system is the least well-known system, right? Everyone knows the skeletal system is, muscular system, cardiovascular, so on and so forth. But the integumentary, I think, is one that you don't necessarily think about unless you're taking an anatomy and physiology class. Okay, but the integumentary system just consists of your skin, hair, nails, and then also associated structures in your skin, such as sweat glands and oil glands. Okay, we also have a number of different, I'm going to say tactile receptors embedded in our skin that allow us to feel different things, different sensory experiences, pain, vibrations, changes in temperatures. So all of that I would consider part of the integumentary system. Okay, a lot of times as well, people, when they think about your skin, you don't necessarily think about your skin being an organ, but remember what the definition of an organ is. It's a collection of multiple types of tissues that work together to perform a function, right? Your skin, as we'll see on the next few slides, has a number of different tissue types making it up. So we would technically consider your skin to be an organ, okay? The integumentary system is kind of fun because it's all stuff that you can see pretty much unless you're looking at the microscopic level. And it's important if you're going to be a nurse or something like that, because if someone has some sort of injury to the skin, such as a burn or some sort of cancer, which we'll talk about later on in this lecture, then it's important to know the different structures, different functions of the different structures, and how everything's working together. Okay, so let's start by talking about the skin. All right, so your skin consists of two distinct regions, your epidermis and your dermis. Okay, so the epidermis is the most superficial region of the skin. So that's the part of the skin that you can see, right? If you're touching your skin, you're touching the epidermis. I don't know if in middle school everyone would say your epidermis is showing, but that's just the most superficial region of your skin. It is made up of epithelial tissue and is avascular. So when we talked about tissues in the last chapter, we talked about stratified, squamous epithelial tissue. Okay, so that's the type of tissue that's making up the epidermis, stratified squamous epithelial tissue, and avascular, which you should know what that means from last chapter. But avascular means that there's no direct blood flow to the epidermis. Okay, and many of you have probably heard that, your skin that you see is dead, right? And the top layers of your skin flake off. That's the dead skin, leaving. The reason why those most superficial layers of your epidermis is dead is because it is too far away from the blood supply, which is found down in the dermis, to get the nutrients it needs. Okay, so the dermis is underneath the epidermis. So let's say here this layer is our epidermis, and then deep to that, we'll do blue. Blue would be your dermis. Okay, so it's deep to the epidermis. It's made of mostly fibrous connective tissue, and it's vascular. Okay, so that means vascular, again, that there's blood flow through it, right? So there's going to be veins, arteries, so on. Okay, so those two regions make up your skin. And again, these superficial cells of your epidermis die because all the nutrients from the vascularization in your dermis, they can go up a certain, way, they just diffuse up. But these most superficial regions don't get any of those nutrients from the blood, so they end up dying. Okay. All right. And then another region that a lot of people normally think is in your skin, but actually isn't, is your hypodermis. So your hypodermis is deep to the dermis. It is subcutaneous, right? So this is our cutaneous layer. So below that would be subcutaneous. It's not technically part of the skin. Okay, so that's why we say skin has two regions, but it does share some similar function. A lot of the functions you'll see that we talk about later, the hypodermis also is involved in. It's mostly made up of adipose tissue, which you should also know from last chapter is fat. So the majority, you can't see that at all, the majority of the cells in the hypodermis are those big fat globules, those adipose tissues, which you should know is a loose connective tissue, right? Loose adipose connective tissue. It absorbs shock, insulate, holds fat reserves. And the hypodermis is really important because it functions to anchor skin to underlying structures, which in most cases is going to be muscle. Okay, so those are the regions of the skin. Let's talk a little bit more about the epidermis. So again, epidermis is most superficial. So you can see on this image here, this top like brown layer would be the epidermis. Okay. It consists mostly of keratinized, stratified squamous epithelial. Okay, so stratified squamous epithelial we talked about in great detail in the previous chapter. We haven't really mentioned what keratinized means, but keratinized just means that there's a pigment called keratin that is found in the stratified squamous cells. And keratin helps to create kind of like a waterproofing of these cells so that, you know, your skin can form a barrier. Okay, so keratin is just a protein that you would find. Okay, there's specialized cells within the epidermis that have specific functions as well. 4 cell types. The first would be the keratinocytes. They produce the fibrous keratin that I just mentioned that's giving skin its protective properties. So again, it's going to be kind of like a waterproofing, add some resilience to the cells, make them a little bit more durable. So keratin is really important. Keratinocytes are the major cells of the epidermis. So technically, keratinocytes are a special kind of the stratified squamous. Okay, they're stratified squamous because they're those pancake flat shape, and stratified because there's a lot of rows of them, right, for protection. But they're just called keratinocytes because they especially have that protein keratin. Okay. The next type of cell you'll see in the epidermis are melanocytes. They're spider-shaped cells in the deepest layers of the epidermis. They're really important because they produce the pigment called melanin, which I feel like most people have probably heard of before. But melanocytes, what they do is they produce this melanin pigment. They package it up into little melanosomes. So think you have little melanosomes with the melanin pigment produced in these melanocytes, is how I'll draw them like that. These melanosomes that have melanin, the pigment inside, are going to move and transfer into the keratinocytes. Okay, so the color that you see in the skin is technically found in the keratinocytes themselves. Okay, but it's produced in the melanocytes, packaged into these melanosomes, and then transferred up to the keratinocytes. Okay, and then that is what's giving your skin the majority of the pigment that you see. So melanin is really important because it's going to be protecting the skin from UV damage. Okay, it's a pigment that helps protect the skin. Obviously, UV rays are damaging. They can cause damage to the DNA in the cell nucleus, and if that happens, it can lead to issues such as skin cancer. So the melanin is just a way for your body to protect its skin from those harmful UV rays. Okay, the next type of cell we have are dendritic or Langerhans cells. They're star-shaped macrophages that patrol the deep epidermis again. We already talked about what macrophage is, but it's an important cell of the immune system. that's going to be able to eat any foreign substance, any sort of pathogen or anything that makes its way into the skin. So if you get a cut and you get some bacteria or something in there, the dendritic cells are going to find that bacteria and quite literally eat them, macrophage them, to kill them, to make sure they don't get into the deeper tissues. And then finally, you're going to have tactile or Merkel cells that are going to be sensory receptors that sense touch. And a little bit later on, we'll talk about the different types of sensory receptors we have. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about that. But you also have these sensory receptors that are able to allow you to feel things. Okay. So we have those important cell types in the epidermis. And we can divide the dermis up into 4 or 5 distinct layers depending on where in the body we're at. Okay, so we have 2 types of skin technically in our body. We have thick skin and we have thin skin. Thick skin is going to contain the 5 layers. The thin skin is only going to have 4 layers. Okay. Thick skin we're going to find in areas that are high abrasion, such as our hands or our feet. Okay, so obviously your hands and feet are going to be interacting with things the most, right? So you want thick skin with an extra layer of protection to make sure that you have enough protection on those areas that, you know, are going to be interacting with the world. Thin skin everywhere else in our body. So your arms, your torso, your skin on your face, it's not going to hopefully come into contact with that many things. You're not using it and gripping stuff with your elbows, whatever. So you don't need that extra layer of protection. Okay, so everywhere in your body, normally 4 layers of skin. Thick skin on your feet and hands, especially like the palms of your hands and the soles of your feet, right? Those parts that are interacting with the world are going to have 5 layers. Okay, so these are the 5 layers. We have stratum basale, which is going to be the deepest layer. Stratum spinosum, granulosum, lucidum. This is the layer that's only found in thick skin. And stratum corneum is going to be the most superficial. Okay, so superficial again means towards the surface. So towards the surface, and then as you go up this list, you're getting deeper and deeper. Okay, and it's important that you know the layers of the skin in their correct order. And how I remember that is a mnemonic where you come up with a catchy little phrase where the first letter of each word matches up with, you know, your little phrase. So my little phrase, and I go from superficial to deep, is, I'll do a little, Claire likes grandma's special brownies. Okay, so if you can remember, Claire likes grandma's special brownies. And if you're trying to figure out the layers of skin, if you know the first letter, it's really easy to figure out, you know, what layer your, you know, the quiz question or whatever is asking for. So Claire likes grandma's special brownies. Stratum corneum, lucidum, granulosum, spinosum, and basale. Okay, so that's how I remember them. So now let's take a look at each layer in a little more depth. Okay, so starting at the deepest layer. So this guy is the deepest, which I don't know why I did deep to superficial. I normally talk about them in reverse order, but in this PowerPoint, we're starting deep. So the deepest layer is stratum basale, also known as the basal layer. Deepest layer, it is firmly attached to the dermis. Remember, the dermis is deep to the epidermis, so it makes sense that the deepest layer of the epidermis touches the dermis. The stratum basale consists of a single row of stem cells that actively divide. So they're mitotic, right? They're creating new cells, producing 2 daughter cells at each time, right? So you're going to have cells that are dividing and creating new cells. Every time the cells divide, one of the daughter cells from the basal layer goes to the surface, okay? And this is how the skin replaced itself, okay? So it takes about 25 to 45 days, depending on what's happening with your skin, but for the cells on the surface to be replaced by these new daughter cells from the stem cells. And as the cell moves towards the surface, it's actually dying. Okay, so when it's deeper in the epidermis, it's going to be living because there's enough nutrients and stuff from the blood that's found in the dermis to sustain it. But as it gets further and further away, eventually it's going to die. And as it reaches the top few layers of your epidermis, the cells will be dead. Okay, but every time that these stem cells divide, one of the daughter cells, like I said, is going to move towards the top. The other daughter cells remain in the stratum basale as a stem cell, and it's going to continue to divide and do the same thing over and over again. Again, just to produce the cells that are falling off at the surface. Okay, so the keratinocytes are the cells that these are creating, and about 1 million of those cells fall off every day. Okay, so it's important that we replace them. The layer also sometimes is known as stratum germinativum. I don't know how to say that because of its mitotic properties. Also in this layer, we have those melanocytes that we mentioned earlier. Remember, melanocytes produce the pigment melanin, and that melanin is going to migrate up and get into the keratinocytes to darken it and protect it from the sun. Okay, so that's the deepest layer. The next one, so a little bit more superficial, is the stratum spinosum. This consists of a few cell layers thick. So remember, this is stratified epithelial, so you're going to have multiple layers. So the stratum spinosum has a few layers. We have a big system of a web of intermediate pre-keratin filaments attached to desmosomes. So remember, desmosomes are the cell junctions that hold the cells together, but are kind of like that Velcro or like zipper to allow some movement. Okay, so the main thing you can ignore a lot of this stuff, but desmosomes you should know. Remember, desmosomes are holding the cells together and allowing some moving, but still holding them in place. So you're resisting tension and pulling. If you were to have like tight junctions between these cells, if there was any sort of tension on the skin or pulling on the skin, the cells would just pull apart. Okay, so desmosomes are really important here. We have keratinocytes that are in this layer. Okay, remember, those are going to be found in every layer. When they're in the stratum spinosum, they're going to appear spiky, which is why this is called the prickly layer, because they look like little prickly cells. We have melanosomes in this layer, as well as dendritic cells. Okay. Next layer up is stratum granulosum. We have, again, multiple layers thick. The cells are becoming to get a little bit more flattened by this layer, so it's pretty thin. Okay, so in the stratum spinosum, the keratinocytes are kind of spiky, so they're like this sorta, right? As those cells move up, the cell appearance is going to change. So the keratinocytes are going to be flattened, and at this stage, the nuclei and organelles are going to disintegrate, and keratination begins. Okay, so the protein keratin, again, is going to be made, and it's going to start accumulating in the stratum granulosum in these keratinocytes. Okay, so this is the last like live layer of cells. So as the nuclei and organelles go away, the cells are going to start to die. So in this layer, cells are about to die, dying, and above this, the cells will be dead. Okay, so, and again, this is because we're too far away from the vasculature in the dermis to get nutrients and the things that we need for these cells to live. Okay. The next layer up, so almost to the top now, this would be the second layer, is the stratum lucidum. Again, this is only found in thick skin, so the skin on our hands and our feet. Consists of thin translucent band of 2 or 3 rows of clear flat, dead keratinocytes, okay? Again, it's superficial to the granulosum. So at this point, we just have layers of dead cells. Again, the stratum lucidum in these thick areas is just there to provide extra protection. Okay. And then the most superficial layer is the stratum corneum, and it's going to be very thick, so 20 to 30 rows of flat anucleated, so no more nucleus, keratinized dead cells. Okay. It accounts for 3/4 of the epidermal thickness, so it's a very big chunk of our epidermis. And again, these dead cells are just going to provide protection for the deeper cells. Okay, so all those layers, if we get a little cut or abrasion or touch something hot, those layers are going to provide extra protection so we don't damage the deeper tissue. It also is going to prevent some water loss, right, because it's that waterproofing ability. Protect from abrasion and penetration, which I mentioned, and then act as a barrier against biological, chemical, and physical assaults. So all of that is kind of saying the same thing, and that is just protecting. Okay, so the whole point of these dead cells is to protect the deeper tissue. Okay, so this is what it looks like, the epidermis. Okay, so on the left is an actual microscope image, and then we have on the right the like drawing of it. So again, from superficial to deep, we have stratum corneum. In thick skin, we'd have the stratum lucidum, Claire likes. We have granulosum, spinosum, and the deepest is basale. Okay, so you can see in this deep basal layer, we have melanocytes. This guy's a melanocyte. We have some sensory tactile cells. In the stratum spinosum, we have the dendritic cells and the spiny looking keratinocytes. In the granulosum, the keratinocytes are starting to flatten and also starting to die. And then the stratum corneum and the lucidum, if it was there, is the very flat anucleated keratinocytes. Okay, so you can kind of see there. And then this is what on this side, what it would look like in a other picture, but that's good for now. Okay, so then deep to the epidermis, you have your dermis. So you can see on this image over here, the epidermis, this colors are a little bit different, but the epidermis would be all of the stuff above this pink line I'm drawing. Okay, and the dermis is deep to that. So remember, epidermis is going to be epithelial tissue. The dermis is made up of connective tissue. Okay, remember, you're going to always see connective tissue under epithelial tissue, so that makes sense. Because we have connective tissue, there's going to be a number of different cells. So fibroblasts, macrophages, some mast cells, white blood cells, all the things we talked about in the previous chapter, they're kind of floating around in that matrix of the connective tissue. Okay, we also have the fibers in the matrix that are going to bind everything together. Okay, again, connective tissue is vascular, meaning it has blood vessels. It's also going to be innervated by nerves and lymphatic vessels. Okay, so there's a lot of stuff going on in the dermis because it's all connective tissue. We're also going to see a number of other things, including different hair follicles, oil glands, sweat glands. And we'll talk about specific kinds of all of these in a little bit. Okay, but all that stuff is going to be found in the dermis. Okay, so the epidermis really is only there to have those dead keratinocytes that are most superficial to help protect the deeper skin. Because we have all this stuff going on in the dermis, it's really important that stuff doesn't get damaged, right? We don't want nerve damage, blood vessel damage. We don't want our sweat glands, oil glands. All of that stuff is really important. So it's deeper in the tissue so that it has more protection from the epidermis. Okay. So the dermis is made up of two layers itself. Most superficial, you have the papillary layer, and then deep to that is the reticular layer. So the papillary layer, I would say, is like all of this stuff up here, right? And then the reticular layer would be, I don't know what color to do, orange. The reticular layer is all this stuff down here, okay? And we'll talk about each of those layers right now. So papillary layer, again, is going to be the superficial layer of the dermis. So what layer of the epidermis touches the papillary layer of the dermis? Well, the epidermis, we have Claire-like squamous special brownies. So that's the epidermis. Okay, and then the dermis, we have the papillary layer and then the reticular layer. So the stratum basale, deepest layer of the epidermis, is going to be touching the papillary layer of the dermis. Okay, epidermis, dermis. So you should know all those layers in order and be able to tell me what's next to what. Okay, papillary layer of your dermis is made up of areolar connective tissue, which remember is a loose connective tissue, which it says next. There is collagen fibers, elastic fibers, and blood vessels. These loose fibers allows for a lot of space for other stuff to move around, including some immune cells, some phagocytes to patrol for microorganisms. Okay, which is really important because obviously our skin is exposed to the outside environment. So with the papillary layer having all of those immune cells, if anything gets through the epidermis and it's dendritic cells that are protecting, the papillary layer has all of those phagocytes within the areolar connective tissue to kill any pathogens. Okay. Another really cool thing about the papillary layer, one of my favorite parts of the skin, is the structure called the dermal papillae. Okay, it's going to be the most superficial region of the dermis, and it's going to send finger-like projections up into the epidermis. Okay, so these projections contain different capillaries, nerve endings, and touch receptors. And these are what's responsible for forming our fingerprints. So before I show you that, on this slide, so all of these little blips up, all of these would be dermal papillae. Dermal papillae. Okay? It's at the very top of the papillary layer. Okay, say these little dermal papillae are finger-like projections that go up into the epidermis. Okay? And those are going to be what's responsible for creating our fingerprints. Okay, so there's a few different layers. We have dermal papillae on top of dermal ridges, which give rise to epidermal ridges. Okay, so I'm not going to expect you to know all these different in order, whatever, but you should know that all of the ridges in our dermis, epidermis, and the dermal papillae collectively are known as friction ridges, which are our like our fingerprints, right? So they're going to enhance gripping ability, contribute to the sense of touch, because in those friction ridges, we're going to have different sensory receptors. And there's different sweat duct openings within those friction ridges that are going to leave unique fingerprint patterns. Okay, so our fingerprints, obviously you have like the weird different ridges with different loops and swirls and whirls and whatnot. But then these different little sweat ducts in our fingers are going to give us an even more unique pattern, which is kind of cool. Okay. So that's the papillary layer of the dermis. Deep to that, we have the reticular layer of the dermis, which is thicker. It makes up about 80% of the dermis. It consists of dense fibrous connective tissue. So I'm going to add here, I should have put this in the slide, dense irregular connective tissue. Remember, regular connective tissue is what's making up tendons and ligaments. Dense irregular connective tissue is making up that dermis of our skin, specifically the reticular layer of the dermis. Okay. We have a lot of elastic fibers to provide stretch recoil properties, collagen to provide strength and resilience. Okay, and the collagen also holds water in, keeping the skin nice and hydrated. Okay, so that's the reticular layer. You should know dense, irregular connective tissue. We have a plexus called the cutaneous plexus, which is just, a plexus is a network of blood vessels. Okay, so we have deep to the reticular layer, the cutaneous plexus, and that sits between the reticular layer and the hypodermis, which is deep to it. Okay. We talked about earlier, the hypodermis is made mostly of adipose tissue. We also find adipose tissue within the reticular layer of our dermis. Okay, so there's little pockets of these fat tissues in the dermis as well. Okay. Okay. The reticular layer has some unique features it causes. So one thing that it creates is these cleavage or tension lines. So they're caused by the collagen fibers running parallel to the skin surface. So the collagen fibers are always going to run in like the same way. Okay, and this leads to these they call cleavage lines that you can't see but are really important, especially for surgeons, because they always want to create incisions that are parallel to the cleavage line so they heal more easily. Okay, so in different areas of the body, the collagen fibers are going to run different ways, which is like the coolest thing ever. And a lot of times it kind of matches up with like the ways your muscles are running as well. But if you're doing a incision like on the leg, you want the incision to be parallel, so going the same way as the cleavage lines, because it will heal faster, right? If you cut against it, then these lines are like separated, and it's really hard for those to heal and come back together. So if you cut with the lines, it's going to heal a lot easier, which is kind of cool. We also have something called flexure lines, which are a result of reticular layer feature. So they're going to be dermal folds at or near joints. Okay. So the dermis is tightly secured to the deeper structures. Okay. Obviously, we don't want like our skin separating. The skin's inability to slide easily for joint movement causes these deep creases. Okay, so because the skin, the dermis specifically, is secured so tightly, in areas that we want to move it a lot, it's not going to be able to do that. So it's going to create these flexure lines, which are wrinkles caused by, again, just that dermis not wanting to move from the deeper structures, which is kind of cool. Okay, and the last part about the dermis here, we have another thing, stretch marks, more formally known as striae, which is caused by extreme stretching of the skin. So when you have stretch marks, it's actually dermal tears. So the dermis kind of like separates, and it leaves these little lines that a lot of times look like silvery or white, where the dermis has teared, which is kind of cool. I never really knew what those were from. And then also another thing, blisters are fluid-filled pockets that separate the epidermal and dermal layers. Okay, so different traumas, if you have a lot of friction or something in an area, or you have, a burn or something, the blisters is between the epidermis and dermal layers. Okay. All right, let's talk a little bit more about pigments. So we already talked about how melanocytes found in the stratum basale of the epidermis produce melanin. Melanin is a pigment one of the main pigments that is going to contribute to your skin color. Okay, so melanin is actually the only pigment that is made in the skin. Okay, the other pigments are made elsewhere and are transported, whatever. but melanin is actually made within the skin, again by melanocytes. So it says right here, I was going to write this, but they're packaged into the melanosomes. Melanosomes are sent up to the keratinocytes, and the melanin will sit in the keratinocytes and protect the DNA of the keratinocytes from the UV rays of the sunlight. Okay, so melanocytes just make the pigment, pack them up, and they get sent to the keratinocytes to actually protect the DNA there. Obviously, if you have more sun, there's more of a need for that protective shield, so more melanin will be produced. Okay, so that's what's causing you to tan in the summer. And evolutionarily, people who live closer to the equator obviously are going to be exposed to more sunlight as opposed to further away from the equator. So evolutionarily, those individuals have DNA that makes them naturally produce more melanin even without having to be in the sun, because they have so much sun exposure. Okay, so it's really important that they have that extra melanin in their skin to protect them from the UV light where they are living. Okay, so there's different types of melanin. There is a melanin that's reddish yellow, and then there is a melanin that's kind of brownish black. Okay, so skin color differences are due to not only the amount, but the form of melanin that you have. Okay, so some people have more olive toned skin, which would be more of the reddish yellow. Some people have, really dark skin that would be more brown melanin. Okay, and freckles and pigmented moles are also a result of just local accumulations of melanin, which isn't a bad thing. Just melanin in a certain area. Okay. Then there's two other pigments that also contribute to skin color. Keratin is a yellow to orange pigment. It's most obvious in the palms and soles of our feet. This pigment accumulates in the stratum corneum and hypodermis. And it's interesting because it can be converted to vitamin A for vision and epidermal health. Okay, so it's not made in the skin, but it does accumulate in the stratum corneum, which is the most superficial layer. Right? And then the hypodermis, which is technically not part of the dermis, is subcutaneous. I think I spelled that wrong, whatever. And then the last pigment that contributes to skin color is hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is found in blood, right? Your hemoglobin molecules is what's transporting oxygen in your blood. If someone has a pinkish hue to their skin, it's because they don't have as much melanin, and their skin practically is just more transparent, so the color of hemoglobin shows through. So the hemoglobin is just in the blood below your skin, and if your skin doesn't have a lot of that melanin pigment, it'll be more transparent, so you can see the pink color from your blood showing through, which is kind of cool. There's not actually a pigment in your skin that's making it pink. It's just the fact that your skin is see-through. Okay. We can have alterations in the skin color. So differences in our skin color can indicate the presence of diseases. So this is kind of cool. We have a number of different, situations. Cyanosis, I think cyan, is a blue skin color. And this shows low oxygenation of hemoglobin, right? Because when hemoglobin is bound to oxygen, it's going to become bright red. Okay, so if you have low levels of oxygen, the blood is going to look more blue. Okay, so we can see, if we see blue on the surface of our skin, that's an indication we don't have much oxygen in our blood. Which, if you're dead, obviously you're not breathing, your skin's going to look blue because you don't have any oxygen in your blood anymore. We also have pallor, which is a bleaching or pale color. Anemia, low blood pressure, and if you're very scared or angry, that can change your blood pressure as well and lead to a pale color. Erythemia is redness. So that's caused, think erythrocytes. I don't know how to spell it. I'll just say it out loud. Erythrocytes. So fever, hypertension, inflammation, or allergies causes redness in the skin. Jaundice is yellow cast, which is an indication of liver disorders. Bruises, everyone I'm sure knows what that is, black and blue marks on the skin. Sometimes referred to, I never heard that first one, but a hematoma, same thing. It's a result of clotted blood that's beneath the skin. So if you run into your cabinet or something, you're damage your blood vessels, so blood is released, it clots, okay, and that's what causes the bruise. And as the clot is broken down, the color of the bruise changes. So it might start as black to blue, but it gets purple, kind of green, yellow as it's healing. Okay, and then last, there are these bruises that form around someone's like neck, kind of like a necklace. So in axillae, around your armpits and your neck, it can be a sign of insulin resistance and elevated blood glucose levels. So we can tell a lot about someone's health depending on their skin color, which is kind of fun. Okay. So now let's talk a little bit more about the receptors that we can find in our skin. So this information I don't think is in your book, but I included it here because I think it's important. And definitely in lab, you guys are going to be talking about the different types of receptors and stuff like that. So I just wanted to include it on our lecture slides as well. So we have three main types of receptors: mechanoreceptors, thermoreceptors, and nociceptors. So mechanoreceptors, there's a lot of different kinds of them, but all mechanoreceptors feel or are activated by mechanical changes, let's say. So any sort of touch, right? So if you think mechanical changes, if you touch on your skin, we haven't talked about the nervous system yet, but that's considered a mechanical change. You're physically changing something. Think of mechanic is going to go in and physically move something. So if you're moving your skin with touch, it's considered a mechanical change. So mechanoreceptors respond to that. So we have Meissner's corpuscles, which are responsible for just light touch. Merkel discs, which respond to a harder touch or more pressure. Ruffini corpuscles, which respond to constant touch or pressure. Pacinian corpuscles, which respond to vibration. Okay, so different types of touch is going to actually activate different types of receptors on your skin. And this is important because we want to be able to distinguish between like a light touch or a heavy touch. And it's impossible to do that with one type of receptor, right? Because if anything turns it on, the same signal is going to be sent, right? So we have different receptors to feel these different things, okay? We also have thermoreceptors, which are responding to changes in temperature. So these actually have channels on them that when the temperature changes, it's going to open that channel and send an action potential to the nervous system so that we can sense the change in temperature. And then nociceptors are my favorite. They respond to pain. Okay, and I like them a lot because what's interesting to me, on our tongue, we have taste buds that we can taste salty, sweet, umami, which is like earthy flavors, sour, and bitter. I think that's it. It's been a minute since I taught this. 5 different tastes and specific taste buds for each taste. But if we eat a spicy food, there's not actually a taste bud that tastes spice. Instead, it's nociceptors responding to spice. So there's a spice called capsaicin that you found in hot peppers and stuff like that isn't actually a flavor. It just is hurting us when we eat it, but people like that. People like that a little bit of pain, I guess. Okay. So it shows the receptors in the skin. So there are, again, depending on the type of receptor, going to be different areas. So we have our epidermis, superficial. Our dermis is deep to that. So Merkel discs are for just touch. Meissner's corpuscle, very light touch. Okay, so those are going to be more superficial because we want to feel the really light stuff. As we get deeper, they're going to respond to deeper types of touch. So Ruffini ending down here is responding to the touch and pressure, Pacinian corpuscle pressure as well. So the deeper we get, the harder the pressure we're going to need to be able to activate them, which makes sense because if they're too close to the surface, they would get activated too easily. Okay, and then we also have these free nerve endings, pain, itch, and temperature. Okay. All right, now let's move on and talk about the last type of things we can find in our dermis, which you can see right here, are sweat glands. So let's talk about the different types of sweat glands. Okay, so sweat glands are also known as sudiferous glands, just their general name. They're found everywhere in our bodies except the nipples and parts of our external genitalia. But everywhere else, there's about 3 million sweat glands, I think, could be wrong, per person on your body. And there's 2 types that we're going to talk about. We have eccrine, also known as merocrine sweat glands, and then apocrine sweat glands. Okay, and all of these sweat glands are going to contain myoepithelial cells, which are going to be able to contract upon the nervous system stimulation to force sweat into ducts. Okay, so sweat glands are all exocrine glands because they release sweat to the outside of the body. And they need the nervous system innervation for these myoepithelial cells to contract and force sweat out. Okay, so let's start by talking about the eccrine glands. So eccrine, this should be green. You do need to know this. Important. Eccrine or merocrine sweat glands are the most numerous, abundant everywhere, but on palms, soles, and forehead, places you sweat a lot. Their ducts are going to just connect to the pores in our skin, and their main function is thermal regulation. So if you're hot and you sweat to cool off, that is because of these eccrine glands releasing sweat, okay? And this is regulated by the sympathetic nervous system, which we'll talk about that later on, the different nervous systems, but just so you see that word now, thermoregulation is regulated by the sympathetic nervous system. And their secretion, obviously, is sweat. Okay, so there's a few different types of sweat glands. Eccrine sweat glands produce, really watery sweat. So it's going to be mostly water, but a little bit of salt, some vitamin C, antibodies, metabolic wastes, but mostly water and salt. Okay, so just very watery sweat. Okay, the second type of sweat gland you need to know is the apocrine sweat glands. Okay, these are not found all over the body. They are only found in auxiliary and genital areas. So auxiliary, you should know that term, is your armpit, and genital by your genitals. Okay, they also produce sweat, technically, but it's not just sweat. It's kind of milky, yellowish sweat that contains a lot of fats and proteins. Okay, so it's not just liquid sweat for thermal regulation. It's just this fatty, proteiny, thick yellow sweat, which sounds kind of gross. And this is the sweat that leads to body odor, because you have actually bacteria that are going to come in and break that sweat down, leading to body odor, which is a lot of times why like deodorants and stuff, natural deodorants, you'll see have like tea tree oil in them. Tea tree is antimicrobial, so it'll kill bacteria. So those natural deodorants hope to work by killing bacteria using essential oils that are antimicrobial. Okay. Apocrine glands are larger than eccrine glands because I always remember if they're producing this like fat protein sweat, it's going to be like a thicker sweat, so they need a bigger gland to pump it out. These empty into hair follicles, so not into just pores, but hair follicles. So you're going to always see these ducts associated with hair follicles. And there's two types of modified apocrine glands, which these are both technically sweat glands as well. Sermoneous glands, which are found in the ear, that secrete a specialized type of sweat that is earwax. It's kind of weird that that's a sweat gland, but that it is. And then mammary glands are also a specialized type of sweat gland found in breasts that secrete milk. Okay. Apocrine glands, they don't really know their function. So, I mean, the eccrine glands, we know they're for thermal regulation, right? Apocrine glands, the function really is still kind of unknown. They begin functioning at puberty. So they begin functioning at puberty, and they think they have some role in like a sexual scent gland with pheromones, but there's not enough research to really know exactly what they do. Okay, and the other type of gland we're going to be looking at is sebaceous oil glands. So this again should be green. Sorry, it's bugging me. It's not green. Sebaceous oil glands are everywhere except for thick skin. So the palms of our hands, soles of our feet, you don't have sebaceous glands. Sebaceous glands produce oil. I'm going to jump down here. They secrete sebum, which is an oil secretion. It has bacterial killing properties and also is really important to soften our hair and skin. Okay, so the oil on our skin is really important so our skin doesn't like dry out. Most sebaceous glands you're going to see are secreting into the hair follicles. Okay, which is why if you don't shower, your hair is going to get really oily on the hair on your head because these oil glands secrete their sebum, the oil, right onto the hair itself. Okay. They're relatively inactive until puberty, stimulated by hormones, especially androgens. Acne is usually an infectious inflammation of these sebaceous glands. So anytime you see acne, typically it's because of these glands have some sort of infection. There's bacteria that get in them that block the glands and cause different types of acne. So whiteheads is a certain type of bacteria. The blackheads are something different. And also if you ever heard of like cradle cap in babies where they have like that loose skin on their heads, that is as a result of overactive sebaceous glands in infants is what leads to cradle cap. If anyone of you know what that is, you can Google it if you want to see what it looks like. Okay, so here's all of them together. Okay, so eccrine, sweat glands, thermoregulation, some antibacterial. Again, it is secreting right onto the skin surface at a pore. You can read the rest of it. Apocrine glands are going to be bigger because remember they're producing that sweat mixed with fat and proteins. Sexual scent gland maybe. they're always going to be associated with a hair follicle. So you'll see upper part of a hair follicle. So they're secreting their substances directly onto the hair. And then sebaceous also is going to be found off the hair follicle. And they produce sebum, which is the oil. Okay, so I'm going to stop here and have this part 1 of the chapter 5 lecture. And I'll finish the rest of chapter 5 in a part 2.